A hushed suburban street lay still beneath a crimson-hued dawn. The eerie quiet was shattered by the wail of police sirens slicing through the morning air. Officers swarmed the pristine cul-de-sac, boots pounding against manicured lawns. The tidy facade of Mark's two-story house stood starkly against the chaos within. A woman's desperate sobs echoed from the open front door, blending with the shrill commands of law enforcement. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where blood-stained hardwood floors or where darkness crept into polite society. But today, it was. Emma, just 17, sat trembling on the front steps, her breath hitching with panicked sobs. Blood smeared her pale hands, staining the edges of her hoodie sleeves. She rocked slightly, eyes wide and unseeing, as neighbors gathered at a cautious distance, their whispers thick with fear. "Mom, are you hurt?" a paramedic asked urgently, kneeling beside her. Emma shook her head frantically. "It's not mine," she stammered between gasps. "Hannah. He hurt Hannah." The paramedic's face hardened. "Stay here," he instructed, signaling to a colleague. Emma's voice cracked through the morning air, raw with anguish. "I tried to stop him," she cried, as tears cut through the blood on her face. Inside the kitchen, the scene was one of horror. Hannah lay sprawled on the cold tile floor, her golden hair tangled and slicked with crimson. Her breathing was shallow, chest rising and falling with agonizing effort. "We need a stretcher, Stat," a paramedic barked as they assessed the extent of her injuries. The pool of blood around her painted a grotesque picture, the bright red stark against the gleaming tiles. A first responder pressed gauze to her side, trying to staunch the flow. Hannah's lips trembled as if forming words, but nothing emerged. Her eyes fluttered closed, her body sinking deeper into unconsciousness. "Stay with me," the paramedic urged, voice tight with urgency. "We're going to get you through this." Mark sat slumped on the floor a few feet away, blood smeared across his shirt and hands. The knife glinted in the harsh light, still clutched loosely in his trembling grip. "Drop the weapon," an officer commanded, gun drawn. Mark blinked, dazed, as if waking from a nightmare. His gaze drifted to Hannah's motionless form, and a ragged sob escaped his throat. "Please," he muttered, barely audible. "I didn't mean... I just..." The officer's voice was unyielding. "Now!" The knife clattered to the floor as Mark's shoulders sagged in defeat. His face twisted with a grotesque mix of regret and madness. Another officer cuffed him, roughly pulling him to his feet. Mark offered no resistance, his hollow eyes fixed on the blood pooling beneath Hannah. The cacophony of voices filled the room, officers issuing commands, paramedics coordinating Hannah's transport, and Emma's anguished cries echoing through the house. Mark stood like a ghost, handcuffed and silent, as officers dragged him toward the front door. "Why did this happen?" one neighbor muttered from behind the police barricade. "What's wrong with these people?" another whispered. Emma's voice cut through the noise, hoarse and raw. "He's my dad," she choked out, disbelief etched into every syllable. The officers exchanged grim glances. No one had answers, only a tragedy that demanded explanations no one was prepared to give. The suburban facade that once promised safety and tranquility had been torn apart, revealing shadows that had festered beneath the surface for years. Neighbors whispered about Mark, the respected accountant, the quiet father. None had seen the darkness lurking behind his polite smile. Emma's mind raced, replaying every red flag she'd ignored. Her father's lingering glances, The awkward conversations, Hannah's discomfort that had seemed fleeting at the time. How had it come to this? How had love twisted into something grotesque and violent? As Mark was loaded into the back of a squad car, Emma watched with hollow eyes. The weight of betrayal pressed heavy on her chest. This was just the beginning, the unraveling of a story stained with blood, lies, and devastating truths waiting to be unearthed. The town of Crestwood was the kind of place people imagined when dreaming of a perfect life. Manicured lawns lined every street, the gentle hum of sprinklers a near-constant soundtrack. Children played on driveways, their laughter bouncing off the pastel-colored houses. Neighbors exchanged polite waves and half-hearted smiles as they hurried back to their lives behind closed doors. But appearances were deceiving. Behind the freshly painted doors and blooming flower beds lay secrets, whispered under the cover of night. In one of these homes, the veneer of normalcy was beginning to crack. Mark Parker's home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a pristine yard masking the disarray within. Once a proud father and a successful accountant, Mark was now a shell of the man he used to be. His wife, Linda, had left a year ago, taking half of everything, except the memories. Those lingered, suffocating him in the emptiness of the house they'd built together. Most evenings, Mark would sit in his recliner, nursing a drink while the television flickered with muted images. Loneliness hung over him like a fog. The days blurred together, each one a reminder of his fading relevance. Work felt meaningless, and his relationship with Emma, his teenage daughter, was distant at best. She spoke to him only when necessary. Her words clipped and tinged with irritation. He couldn't pinpoint when it began, but Hannah's presence in their home had become comforting. Emma's best friend had a way of lighting up a room, her laughter breaking through the monotony. At first it was harmless, a fatherly fondness for the girl, who brought warmth back into his cold world. But something darker was beginning to take root, though Mark refused to acknowledge it. Emma Parker was a girl caught in the in-between, 17, with one foot in childhood and the other in a world that demanded too much too soon. The divorce had left her navigating uncharted waters alone. Her mother had moved across the state, promising to visit, but rarely following through. Her father, though physically present, felt like a stranger. At school, Emma blended into the background. She wasn't unpopular, but she wasn't magnetic like Hannah. The other girls envied Hannah's confidence, while Emma clung to her as a lifeline. In Hannah's shadow, she found safety, a place to hide from the chaos of her life. Yet, Emma wasn't blind. She saw the way her father lingered in the living room when Hannah came over. The way his demeanor shifted, how he tried too hard to appear jovial, his eyes lingering just a second too long. It made her stomach twist, but she buried the unease. Confronting him felt impossible. After all, wasn't he just trying to be friendly? Hannah Lane had always known how to command attention. Her red hair and easy smile made her unforgettable, but it was her energy that drew people in. She had a way of making others feel special, even when her own life was far from perfect. Her home life was a mess. Her mother was unpredictable, bouncing between boyfriends and barely holding down a job. Her father was long gone, a shadow from her childhood she rarely spoke of. Emma's home, with its quiet routines and unspoken rules, was a refuge. Mark treated her with a kindness she wasn't used to, and Emma's loyalty gave her a sense of belonging. Hannah didn't notice the subtle shifts in Mark's demeanor. To her, he was just a kind man, a father figure who asked about her day and listened when she vented about her family. If his compliments lingered on her appearance, she chalked it up to awkwardness. Adults were weird like that. Mark found himself looking forward to Hannah's visits more than he cared to admit. Her presence was like sunlight streaming into a dark room, and he soaked it up. He offered to help her with her college applications, guiding her through the overwhelming process. It felt good to be needed again, but there were moments that unsettled even him. Like the time he'd complimented her dress and she'd laughed, brushing it off as a joke, or the way his pulse quickened when she smiled at him. He told himself it was harmless. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong, just being friendly. Yet his thoughts betrayed him. He began imagining scenarios that made him feel both exhilarated and ashamed. He clung to the belief that he was just filling the void left by his wife, that his intentions were pure. But the line between affection and obsession was growing thinner by the day. Emma wasn't sure when she first noticed the shift, but it was impossible to ignore. Her father's jokes were louder when Hannah was around. His movements more animated. He seemed to find excuses to linger in the room, even when the girls were watching movies or doing homework. "Your dad's funny," Hannah had said once, her tone light. "Yeah, hilarious," Emma replied, forcing a smile. Inside, unease churned. She didn't know how to articulate it, but something about the way her father looked at Hannah made her skin crawl. Still, she pushed the thought away. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe it was nothing. Hannah didn't see the storm brewing beneath the surface. She was used to adults being awkward around her, teachers, neighbors, even her mother's boyfriends. Mark was no different. He was just another lonely adult who enjoyed her company. If anything, she pitied him. "He's sweet," she told Emma one afternoon. "You should be nicer to him." Emma rolled her eyes. "You don't know him like I do." Hannah shrugged, dismissing the warning. To her, Mark was harmless. He listened when she talked about her mother's latest meltdown and offered advice without judgment. In a way, she saw him as the father she never had. Beneath the laughter and casual conversations, tensions simmered. Mark's glances grew longer, his compliments more frequent. Emma's discomfort deepened, but she couldn't bring herself to confront him. And Hannah, blissfully unaware, continued to visit, oblivious to the growing danger. The cracks in their fragile dynamic widened with each passing day. The Parker household, once a sanctuary for Emma and her best friend, had become a powder keg, and all it would take was a single spark to ignite the explosion that none of them saw coming. Mark's fixation on Hannah grew like a creeping vine, tightening its grip on his rationality. He found excuses to be near her, timing his arrivals at home to coincide with her visits. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just a lonely man enjoying the company of a vibrant young woman. But soon, it wasn't enough to see her only at the house. Mark began showing up at school events unannounced. He'd sit in the back during basketball games, watching her cheer on the team with unyielding focus. He even made appearances at parent-teacher nights, though Emma was more than old enough to handle those on her own. "Did you see my dad there last night?" Emma asked Hannah after school one day. Hannah laughed lightly. "Yeah. He said he was just curious about how school stuff works these days." Emma frowned. Curious? That didn't sound right. The tension finally boiled over one evening. Emma cornered her father in the living room, arms crossed and voice firm. "Why do you keep showing up at my school events?" Mark looked up from his newspaper, feigning confusion. What are you talking about? Dad, you've been at like 3 games in the last month. It's weird. He folded the paper neatly and leaned forward, his voice calm, but tinged with defensiveness. I just want to support you. Is that a crime now? Don't gaslight me. Emma shot back, her frustration mounting. This isn't about me, and you know it. Mark's expression hardened. Maybe you're imagining things. Teenagers tend to do that. Emma's stomach churned with unease. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but Mark's stone-cold dismissal left her doubting herself. The next day, Hannah and Emma sat on the bleachers after school. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. Can I tell you something weird? Hannah said, her voice quieter than usual. Emma nodded. Of course. Your dad? I don't know. Sometimes he just stares at me, like... I don't know how to explain it. Emma's chest tightened. You think it's creepy? Hannah hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. I don't think he means anything by it. Maybe I'm overreacting. You're not. Emma's voice was firm. Trust me, you're not. Mark's subtle manipulation intensified. He offered to help Hannah with her college applications, positioning himself as a supportive mentor. You're smart, Hannah, he told her one evening at the kitchen table. You just need someone to guide you through the process. Hannah smiled, grateful for the attention. Thanks, Mr. Parker. My mom doesn't really know how this stuff works. Call me Mark, he insisted, his voice soft. I'm happy to help. As the weeks passed, Hannah found herself confiding in him more and more. He listened without judgment when she talked about her mother's drinking and the revolving door of boyfriends. You deserve better than that chaos, Mark told her one evening, his gaze lingering on her face. You're special, Hannah. Don't ever forget that. Hannah's heart ached at the sincerity in his tone. She didn't see the danger lurking beneath his kindness. Emma watched their interactions with mounting unease. The way her father's hand would linger on Hannah's shoulder, the way he laughed too easily at her jokes. It all felt wrong. One evening, as Hannah and Mark worked on college essays at the kitchen table, Emma leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Hey, Hannah, she said casually. Want to watch a movie or something? Sure, Hannah replied, gathering her papers. You don't have to go, Mark interjected, his tone a bit too eager. We were making good progress. Emma's eyes narrowed. She can finish later, right, Dad? Mark's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. Of course. The distance between father and daughter grew wider, an unspoken battle brewing between them. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. Hannah was over late, finishing up an essay while Mark made coffee. Emma had gone to bed early, leaving them alone in the dimly lit kitchen. As Hannah reached for her notebook, Mark's hand brushed against hers. The touch lingered just a second too long. Hannah froze, her heart racing. Thanks, she muttered, pulling her hand away. Mark's eyes held a strange intensity. You're really something, you know that. Hannah forced a laugh, her discomfort palpable. I should probably get going. I'll walk you out, he offered quickly. No, it's fine, she said firmly, grabbing her bag. Good night, Mr. Parker. As she hurried out the door, her breath came in shallow gasps. Something had shifted, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning, Hannah sat across from Emma at their usual lunch spot. Her expression was grim. I can't come over anymore, she said flatly. Emma's heart sank. Why? What happened? I don't feel comfortable around your dad. He's I don't know how to explain it, but I need some space. Emma nodded, her voice steady. I get it. I'm sorry. It's not your fault, Hannah said gently, but I need to take care of myself. Rejection gnawed at Mark's fragile psyche. He sat in his car outside Hannah's house, the engine idling as he watched the lights flicker inside. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. She hadn't returned his texts or calls. The connection they'd built was slipping through his fingers, and it left a gaping hole in his chest. You're just worried about her, he told himself, justifying his presence. She needs someone to look out for her. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. His obsession had consumed him, warping his thoughts and driving him to the brink. As he sat there, unseen in the shadows, a dangerous resolve began to take shape. If he couldn't be near Hannah, he'd find another way to feel close to her, no matter the cost. Emma sat on her bed, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media. Her room, usually a sanctuary, felt heavy with the tension of recent events. Hannah hadn't been over in weeks, and Emma missed her friend's grounding presence. She shot Hannah a text. Hey, wanna come over for a sleepover? Like old times? I miss you. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed. I don't know. Things have been weird with your dad. Emma clenched her jaw. He won't bother us. I promise. There was a long pause. Then, okay, I'll be there after dinner. Relief washed over Emma. For one night, maybe things could feel normal again. Mark sat in the darkened living room, the glow from the TV casting flickering shadows across his face. He barely registered the sounds of the news anchor droning on about the latest headlines. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on Hannah. She had cut him off completely, leaving him adrift in a sea of rejection and humiliation. The connection he thought they shared had been shattered, and the loss gnawed at him relentlessly. When he heard the front door open and the sound of Hannah's laughter, something inside him twisted painfully. He stood silently in the hallway, watching as the girls made their way upstairs. A dangerous resolve hardened in his chest. If he couldn't have her attention, he would make her understand. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Hannah tiptoed downstairs, her bare feet cool against the hardwood floor. She poured herself a glass of water, the faucet's gurgle loud in the stillness. Couldn't sleep? Hannah jumped, nearly dropping the glass. Mark stood in the doorway, his face partially obscured by shadows. I was thirsty, she said, her voice steady despite the unease creeping through her. Mark stepped closer, his movements deliberate. I've missed talking to you, Hannah. She took a step back. It's late. I should get back to Emma. He blocked her path, desperation flickering in his eyes. Please, just listen. I need you to understand. You're the only one who's ever made me feel seen. Hannah's stomach churned. Mr. Parker, this isn't appropriate. Mark's voice trembled as he spoke. I'm not some monster, Hannah. I care about you. Stop, she said firmly, her pulse racing. You're her dad. This is wrong. I just want to be close to you, he pleaded, his voice cracking. You're a pathetic old man, she spat, her disgust palpable. Stay away from me. The words cut deep, shattering whatever fragile composure he had left. Mark's expression twisted into something dark and unrecognizable. Years of loneliness, rejection, and humiliation boiled over into a blinding fury. You think you can talk to me like that? He snarled, his voice low and dangerous. Hannah's instincts screamed at her to run, but before she could move, he lunged at her, his hands reaching for her shoulders. The kitchen erupted into chaos. Hannah fought back with every ounce of strength she had, kicking and clawing at Mark's arms. Utensils clattered to the floor, and a chair toppled over as they struggled. "Let go of me!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. Mark's grip was unrelenting, his mind clouded by rage. He slammed her against the counter, knocking the breath from her lungs. Desperation fueled Hannah's movements as she grabbed a knife from the counter and swung wildly. But Mark knocked it from her hand. Emma's heart pounded as she woke to the sound of crashing downstairs. She bolted out of bed, fear tightening her chest. "Dad?" she called, racing toward the kitchen. The scene that greeted her froze her in place. Hannah was on the floor, blood staining her shirt. Mark knelt over her, a knife in his trembling hand, his face twisted in horror and disbelief. "No!" Emma screamed, her voice piercing the night. Mark looked up, his eyes wide with shock. "I didn't mean—" But the truth hung heavy in the air. Terror gripped Emma as she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy, cast-iron skillet. "Get away from her!" she shouted, her voice breaking. Mark's expression flickered between rage and confusion. "You don't understand," he muttered, stepping toward her. Driven by pure instinct, Emma swung the skillet with all her strength. The sickening thud echoed through the room as Mark crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as the weight of what she had done settled over her. The kitchen fell into eerie silence, broken only by Hannah's ragged breathing. Emma dropped the skillet, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Hannah!" she choked out, dropping to her knees beside her friend. "Stay with me, please." Mark lay motionless, his chest rising and falling shallowly. Emma fumbled for her phone, dialing emergency services with trembling fingers. "We need an ambulance," she said through sobs. "Please hurry." As the sirens wailed in the distance, the weight of the night's horror pressed down on Emma, forever changing the lives of everyone in that picture-perfect suburbia. Red and blue lights flashed against the dark sky, illuminating the chaos inside the Parker household. Uniformed officers stormed the kitchen, guns drawn. Emma knelt on the blood-slicked floor, clutching Hannah's trembling hand. "Stay with me," Emma begged, her voice raw. Paramedics swarmed in, lifting Hannah onto a stretcher. Blood soaked through the white fabric as they wheeled her toward the ambulance. "Go with her," a paramedic urged Emma. But Emma's legs wouldn't move. Her eyes were locked on her father, Mark, who sat slumped against the cabinets, his face pale and smeared with blood. An officer yanked his arms behind his back, snapping cold metal cuffs around his wrists. "You have the right to remain silent." Mark offered no resistance, his expression vacant as they hauled him to his feet. Emma's scream pierced the night, raw with grief and fury. By morning, the once quiet neighborhood was overrun with news vans and cameras. Reporters crowded the front lawn, microphones poised. Mark Parker, a respected member of the community, has been arrested for the attempted murder of Hannah Green, a high school senior, one reporter announced breathlessly. Neighbors peeked through curtains, their whispers feeding the growing scandal. The headlines blared across every channel. Suburban nightmare. Father's obsession turns deadly. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Mark was led to the defendant's table, shackled and gaunt. Emma sat in the front row, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and anger. The prosecutor's voice cut through the room. "This case isn't just about violence. It's about obsession, manipulation, and betrayal. She presented evidence, text messages, surveillance footage of Mark's car parked outside Hannah's house, and testimony from Hannah herself. He positioned himself as a mentor, but his intentions were far from pure, the prosecutor declared. The defense painted a different picture. My client was a man unraveling under the weight of mental health struggles and a bitter divorce, the defense attorney argued. This wasn't premeditated, it was a tragic consequence of a fractured mind. Mark's hollow eyes met Emma's for a fleeting moment. Guilt and shame flickered in his gaze, but Emma looked away. Her jaw clenched. School became a gauntlet of whispers and sidelong glances. Did you hear what her dad did? She probably knew and didn't say anything. Emma kept her head down, her shoulders hunched under the weight of judgment. Friends she once trusted drifted away, the silence louder than words. At home, the emptiness was suffocating. Her mother, too overwhelmed by shame, barely spoke. Emma sat alone in her room, scrolling through news articles that dissected her family's downfall. Could I have stopped it? The question gnawed at her. Her phone buzzed with a message from Hannah. We need to talk. Emma stared at the screen, her chest tightening with a mix of hope and fear. Hannah's body bore the scars of the attack, but it was her mind that suffered most. She withdrew from everyone, her laughter a distant memory. Nightmares plagued her, pulling her back to that night in the kitchen. When Emma finally visited, the tension between them was palpable. I'm sorry, Emma blurted, tears welling in her eyes. Hannah's expression hardened. It's not your fault, but being around you, it's just too much. The words stung. But Emma understood. They were both fractured, their friendship splintered by trauma. The once close-knit neighborhood fractured under the weight of the crime. Some neighbors spoke in hushed tones about Mark's mental health struggles. He wasn't always like this, Mrs. Whitaker insisted. The divorce broke him. Others were less forgiving. Doesn't matter what he went through, Mr. Darnell snapped. He nearly killed that girl. He's a monster. The divide was impossible to ignore. Emma walked through the neighborhood like a ghost, a living reminder of the darkness that had shattered their idyllic suburbia. Months passed, but the wounds remained fresh. Emma stood by the window, watching the world move on without her. Hannah had transferred to a different school, seeking a fresh start. Mark's trial had ended with a lengthy prison sentence, justice served, but at a heavy cost. Emma's voice broke the silence. Mom, do you think we'll ever be normal again? Her mother sighed, her eyes tired. Normal's gone, sweetheart. But we'll find something new. Emma nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. The world was a fragile place, teetering on the edge of chaos. But Emma knew one thing. They had survived, and somehow they would keep surviving. The house stood eerily still, its once vibrant energy drained by the weight of tragedy. Emma wandered through the hollow spaces, her footsteps echoing against cold tile floors. Framed photos hung crooked on the walls, images of a family that no longer existed as it once had. She paused by the kitchen, now scrubbed clean of blood, but forever stained by memory. The faint scent of bleach lingered, clinging to her senses like guilt. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the faint dent on the cabinet where Mark had fallen after her desperate blow. The silence was deafening. This was supposed to be home. Now it was a monument to betrayal, violence, and shattered innocence. Emma sank onto the living room couch, her body heavy with exhaustion. Her mind played cruel tricks, replaying Mark's desperate pleas and twisted expression. It had started so subtly, a lingering glance, a misplaced compliment. The moments that once seemed harmless had festered into something dark and consuming. She clenched her fists. How did it get this far? She whispered to herself. Her voice trembled as anger mixed with confusion. Love and obsession had danced a perilous line within Mark's fractured mind. What had driven him beyond the brink? The questions gnawed at her, but the answers were elusive, tangled in the shadows of his broken psyche. Even monsters could wear familiar faces. Emma's gaze drifted to the window, where the neighborhood kids played on their bikes, blissfully unaware of the horror that had unfolded just weeks earlier. She thought back to the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest months ago. Her father's sudden appearances at school events, the strange possessiveness in his eyes when Hannah was around. She had dismissed it, told herself she was imagining things. Society teaches you to doubt yourself, to keep the peace, to avoid rocking the boat. But instincts were primal, forged through generations of survival. Emma exhaled sharply, a vow forming in her mind. Never again, she murmured. The neighborhood had always prided itself on its pristine lawns and perfectly curated smiles, but Emma saw through it now. Beneath the polished facade lay secrets, dysfunction, pain, and desperation hidden behind drawn curtains. Her own family had played the game well. They had been the picture-perfect household, the doting father, the hard-working mother, the bright, cheerful daughter. It was all a lie. Emma stood taller, a newfound resolve hardening her features. She would no longer chase perfection or seek validation from a world obsessed with appearances. Authenticity, she whispered, is the only freedom. As she stepped outside, the crisp air filled her lungs. The weight of the past lingered, but it no longer defined her. She had survived the storm, and now she would build a life untethered by fear or shame.